Okay, so good evening, guys. Welcome to KodeCamp 2.0 Android Beginner Training. So today we're going to be talking about activity lifecycle. Okay, we're going to be talking about activity lifecycle. Okay, so in the last class we got to talk about activities and intents, because we also got to implement a menu item button and the like. So today we'll talk about activity lifecycle, which is a very, very important knowledge to have, okay, as an Android developer. Now, one thing you should actually note is that every activity has what is called a lifecycle, okay? Every activity has what we call a lifecycle. So just like your butterfly, so some of us, of course, if you remember your biology, goes from egg, larva, and the likes. So every activity has a life cycle. So what is an activity? Basically, an activity just provides the window in which your application draws what a UI. Activity is just a screen, okay? It's actually the window that typically just fills your screen. Okay, of course, it may be smaller, okay, but that's just what an activity is. So, but from the Android developer .android documentation, okay, an activity is a single focused thing that the user can do. Okay, an activity is a single focused thing that the user can what do. So almost all activities interact with the what user. Almost all activities interact with the user. Okay, so don't forget that it's a single focused thing that a user can actually what do. Now let's move on. Now, so we're talking about what the life cycle of an activity. Okay, so like I was saying, just like the life cycle of the butterfly, egg, larva, pupa, imago, the whole stuff, from biology back then, or integrated science. Okay, so similarly to that, okay, the activity life cycle is made up of different states that an activity can go through. Okay, so the activity life cycle is basically just what's the different states that an activity can go through from when the activity is first initialized to when it is finally destroyed. Okay, and of course, when it's destroyed, the memory is what's reclaimed by the system. So that's what an activity life cycle is. Okay, the different states that an activity can go through from when it is first initialized to when it is finally what destroyed. Okay, so as the user starts the application and navigates between activities, navigates inside and outside of your application, the activity changes its state. Okay, we're going to actually demonstrate those things. The activity changes its state. So we're going to talk about the life cycle states. Now we're going to look at them one by one. Okay, we're going to look at them one by one, and also we're going to actually show how they are called. Okay, we're going to show how they are actually called. So the activity life cycle, okay, typically has, okay, let me see if I can just put up this image. Let's see. I don't know how clear this would be, but let's just, okay. So this is the activity life cycle, okay? Please confirm you can actually see, confirm you can see this, please, very important.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, good. So you have the resumed state, you have the started state, you have the created state, you have the initialized, and you have the destroyed. So it starts first from the initialized state. Okay, it starts first from the initialized state, then it moves up to the created state, then to the started state, then to the resumed state, and of course it can come back from the resumed to the started to the created and down, and then lastly to the destroyed state. Now, these things you're seeing here on create, on start, on restart, these are various methods that are called when these states are activated. So when you're in a particular state, there is a method that is what's called. Now, the one you're used to already is the Oncreate, which is where we're writing our codes, okay, in our activity. So when it is initialized, the Oncreate method is called. When it is created, you now have the Onstart, on restart, okay. When it is in resumed, you have the on resume. When it is now coming back, we also have the on pause, we have the on stop, and then we have the on destroy. Okay, so we're going to look into them one by one, and then we'll actually demo it with the application of our belt. We'll call these methods and we'll see the various places that are being called. And this helps you to actually, write certain functions that you want them to, execute at certain, points in the life cycle of that particular activity. Okay, so let's start with the very first one. Let's just start with the Uncreate. Okay, you've actually been seeing the Uncreate for a while now. Okay, the Uncreate method. Now, but at the same time, I'm going to be teaching you what we call logging, how to log. Yeah, I'll just teach you logging also. So because we're going to be using that to actually see when these methods are being called. Okay, so to actually know what's going on with the Android lifecycle, it's actually very important to know when these lifecycle methods are called. And like I say, to help you really, it helps you in your debugging and everything, to help you hunt down where things are going wrong in your application. So a simple way to actually do that is to use the logging functionality. Okay, and the logging basically, it helps you to write messages, short messages to your console while your app is actually running. And then you can use it to show, you can actually use it to show when the different callbacks, when they are triggered, when there's an issue and the likes. So we're going to use logging to do that. Now, so from the diagram I showed you, okay, in the very first activity lifecycle diagram, the first one we saw was the Uncreate method. So we've used this before. So it's one method that every activity must implement. Okay, now why is that? So now let's start. The Uncreate method is where you should do any one-time initializations for your activity. A one-time initialization, you don't actually have to initialize it again. Any one-time initialization should be done in your Uncreate of your activity. So for example, in our Uncreate, you can see we have the set contents view to inflate the layout. This is a one-time initialization. There's no other time where we would want to, call r.layouts.activity main to inflate the layout. It's a once and for all thing. It's your Uncreate. You should actually define on. You can also define click listeners or set up the view binding. These are once and for all things. You don't have to do them again and again or in another class or in another this thing. So that's actually that. So the Uncreate lifecycle method is called only once. Take note of that. It is called just once. Okay, it's called just once, and it is called just after the activity is initialized. Okay, and what does that mean? What does an activity being initialized mean? It means when the new activity object is created in memory. Remember, just like when you want to create an object of a class, you say val this equals that here. So being initialized means a value has now been given. So when the new activity object is created in memory, okay, that's what we mean by, excuse me, the activity has been initialized. So the Uncreate lifecycle method is called once, just after the activity is initialized. And then after the Uncreate executes, that activity is now considered as being created. Okay, it is called is now called as created. So one thing to note in our Uncreate method here is that when you override the Uncreate method, you must call the superclass implementation to complete the creation of the activity. We have done this before when we looked at classes, objects, inheritance, and the like. Okay, when we're creating functions for inheritance, when we're looking at abstract classes. Okay, so the onCreate method, you must call the superclass. Okay, which this is where we have super.what onCreate. You must call the superclass implementation to complete the creation of the activity. So that's why you see here we actually call what super.what onCreate. And of course, this is true for every other lifecycle callback what methods. So let me do something. So let's now figure out when. So just below this, I'm going to add a log. I'm going to say log.d, or I'll explain that. Now, it takes two things. It takes a tag. For the tag, I'm just going to say this is main activity. Or I'll explain this to you. And then it takes what another thing called the message. So I'll say onCreate called. Okay, onCreate what called. So what is this log here? Okay, by default, it actually just imported the class for me. So the log class writes messages to your log cat. Okay, the log class writes messages to your log cat. So we have our log cat here. The log cat is actually the console for logging messages. That's where you actually see your errors and the like. So it's the console for logging what messages. So messages from Android about your application will appear here, including the ones you explicitly send to the log, just like we are doing in line 24 here, log.what_d. We are explicitly doing that, okay, or any other log class method. So let's break this down, okay? The log, there are three parts of the log command. There are three parts, okay? The first one is the priority of the log message. Okay, the very first one is the priority of the log message. And what basically that means how important the message is. Now here we're using a log.d method. Now what's the log.d method? So let me just add a comment here. So we have the log.d. So what does this do? This sends a debug message. Now we have other ones like we have the log.i. Okay, log.i sends informational messages. We have log.e. Log.e sends error messages. Okay, and then we have log.v. This is for verbose messages. We'll talk about all these things as we move on. So let me just put this verbose messages. Okay, so let's just do this instead. And this is for error. This sends error messages, and then this sends informational messages. Okay, so that's the very first part of the word command, the priority. Okay, that's why we have log.d. So we want to send a debug message. Now, the next part of this command you can see is the tag, the log tag. Okay, so which is actually the very first parameter. Okay, and in this case we are actually putting main activity. So the tag basically is a string that lets you easily find your log messages in the log cat. Okay, but typically it is given the name of the class. Typically it's given the name of the word class. So and then the last one is the actual log messages, okay, which is the second parameter. Is a short string here. So we're just saying onCreate called. So it's actually good convention to declare a tag constant in your class and then reuse it. So what do I mean? I could just do const. Hope I'm actually okay. Let me just const val tag and then main activity. Okay, so Is this not top level? Okay, I think this is fighting me. But well, let's just use this though. Let's just use this though. And then I could just, instead of calling main activity here, because it's possible you actually have, if you always imagine we're actually calling, typing main activity up to like 7-8 times, it's going to be a lot. Okay, so that's actually that. Now let's see what we have now. Let's see what we have. So we're going to, let me run this. Okay, let me run this. So, but just a thing to note, there's what we call a compile time constant. That's what actually const is. What I wanted to use, const. Okay, compile time constant is a value that won't change. Okay, it's a value that will not change. So, okay, so let's move on. So let me run this now. So let's watch here. So I'm going to run this. Okay, so let me run that now. So I'm going to open up my log card. Okay, I'll open up my log card now. So how do we now find it? So I'm just going to come here. Now this is actually in verbose, so I can change this to debug. I can, but let's just leave it first. And then, so what is our tag? Is what main activity, right? So you can see it, main activity. So main activity was called. Sorry, on create code rather, we can see our log message. Okay, so of course, you know, log card contains a lot of messages. Okay, and most of them they are actually not, they are definitely not useful to you. So this is how we filter log entries. Okay, you can just search in it. Okay, because you actually know the name, or you can just switch to either of this depending on which one. Okay, so if you notice, our log message includes the date, the time, the name of the package, okay, the name of the package, your log tag, and then the actual message. Okay, so the fact that this message appears, we know that we have actually called the Oncreate method. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on. So the second one, okay, the second method is the Onstart method. Okay, the Onstart method. So the Onstart method is called just after the Oncreate. The Onstart method is called just after the Oncreate. So after Onstart runs, your activity is visible on the screen. Okay, in your Oncreate is called only once to initialize the activity, but Onstart is called just after Oncreate. And when you call Onstart, it now means your activity is visible on the screen. Now, Onstart can be called many times in the life cycle of your activity. Okay, it's not like Oncreate that's called only once. You can call Onstart many times. Okay, so now let me show you something, because our Onstart is paired with a corresponding onstop lifecycle method, meaning that if the user starts your application and then returns to to the device's home screen, that means the activity is stopped and is no longer visible to the screen. Okay, it means it's no longer visible to the screen. So let me just show you that. Yeah, so you can see on the Onstart, or have it on restart, but we'll talk about that later. It has a corresponding onstop. So Onstart means that the activity that is visible to the user is visible. So the corresponding onstop means it is no longer visible. Okay, it means that it is no longer visible. So so I'll just take that again. Onstart is called, okay, when it's called just after the Oncreate, okay, and it's called when the activity is becoming visible, is visible to the user. Okay, so let's check that out now. Let's test that. Let's test that. So I'm going to call on start here. So our Oncreate closes up here. So every other method, I'm just going to call them here. So let's actually execute the Onstart. So I'm just going to start typing on start so you can see it. The very first one, override function. So let's override that. You can see we have the super.onStart. Okay, because we said we should implement the super class. Now, okay, so let's do this. So I want to really use that const so that you guys get used to it. So I'm going to add it above here. Yeah. So log message. So let me just log this. Let me just copy this. So here I'm going to say onStart called. Okay, excuse me, onStart called. So let's run this now and then let's see. So we're still using the same tag. Okay, so I'm going to have to install and restart. So open up our log cart and then I'm going to type main activity. So you can see on create called, on start called. So you can see the time is almost the same, almost 1846 323, 1846 36 384. So on start is called just afterwards on create. Okay, now, so remember we said it has a corresponding on stop. So on start means it is visible to the screen. On stop, which is the opposite, that means it is not visible to the screen. So I'm going to press the home button here to exit. Of course, this app now, this activity is visible to the screen. So me pressing the home button means you're not seeing this activity again. So let me do that. Okay, now we don't see what happens. Okay, then let me go back. You can see on start is called again. That means it is now what's visible again. I'll take that again. I'll leave it. Means I'm not seeing. That means on stop is called, but we are not overriding it. So that's why we're not seeing it here. But it's not long. That particular activity, that particular screen is not visible. So when I go back, you see on start is what called. Okay. So let's do something. Now, let me add the remaining log statements. I'll just add all of them. Okay, let me add all of them and then we'll now play around to see when they are called. Okay, with our application. So we have on start and then we have on resume. So I'm going to add the log and here I'm going to say on resume. Now we have on pause. And then we have on stop. And then on destroy. Yeah, we have on destroy. And then the last one, we have the on restart. Let's get the on restart. Then log that. And then we're going to on restart. Okay, that's fine. So let's run this application now. And then we'll observe. So observe these lifecycle methods now. So I'm going to open up. So main. So you can see now we have just for the application initializing it being on screen, 3 methods are being called: on create, on start, and what on resume. So on create is to create the application. On start is to start it and make it visible on the screen. On resume here means to give the activity focus and make it ready for the user to interact with it. Okay, so on resume means that that activity has what? Focus. Means a user can actually interact with that particular what? Activity, that particular screen. Okay, now let's actually now pick this up. I know you may feel so. Let's look at a use case. So we're going to use some use cases to understand this now. Okay, we're going to use some use cases. Use case number one is opening and closing the activity. Okay, so this is the basic one, which we know, which we have when we open the app. So let me just close it. Okay, so you can see some methods are being called, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Where are you? Okay, so here, when we open the application for the very first time, okay, the very first time, you can see the Oncreate, you can see the Onstart, you can see the OnResume. Okay, now let me go. So with this, you can see I can interact with it. Now, when I click on C, remember, watch this screen. When I click on D, are you seeing what happens? On pause is called, on stop is called. Why is that? I'll get to show you why. Now, that particular activity, that particular screen where we are calling this method, that particular screen is no longer visible. Okay, it's no longer what? Visible. We can't interact with that screen again. We can't. That is why you have the on pause and the on stop called. So let me go back. We are not, you see, on resume, meaning that we now have focus on this and we can interact with it. Okay, now when I tap the back button also, you can see these are the methods that are being called. We have on pause, on stop, and then finally on destroy. Okay, so when you're using the back button, it causes the activity and the application to be entirely closed. Okay, that's where you now have the execution of the OnDestroy method. So what this OnDestroy actually means is that the activity was fully shut down and you can collect garbage. It's what we call garbage collection. Basically, it's just cleanup of objects that you're no longer using. Okay, now after the OnDestroy is called, the system knows that those resources are discardable and it cleans up the memory. So, but your activity may also be completely shut down if your code manually calls, there's a method called finish, okay, .finish. Okay, if you actually manually call that, it forces the user to quit the app. So for example, the user can force quit or close the app in the recent screen. You know, when you have something like this, you can decide to swipe up your force quitting or closing the app here, okay? But Android may also shut down your activity on its own if your app has not been on screen for a long time. And the reason Android does is to preserve battery and, of course, allow your app resources to be used by other applications. Okay, so I'm going to come back here, and then you see once it was destroyed, for you to see it again, Oncreate was called, Onstart called, OnResume called. Check out the time. Okay. Now, let's move forward. So just like we did before, okay, use case number 2, okay, to navigate away from and then back to the activity. Okay, so let me just clear this. So to navigate away from this activity. Okay, now let me explain something. When you create your activity for the very first time, 3 methods are called, right? On create, on start, and then on resume. Okay, now we're actually also seeing the on stop, on destroy. Okay, that's when your application is shut down and destroyed. But of course, as users interact with their devices, you know, they switch applications. They can return from home, they can start new applications and the like. So note these 2 things. Your activity does not close down entirely every time the user navigates away from the activity. It doesn't close down entirely. First thing, when your activity is no longer visible on screen, This is known as putting the activity into the background. When your activity is no longer visible on the screen, it's also known as putting the activity into the word background. So the opposite of this is when the activity is in the foreground, meaning it's on the screen. Second thing is when the user returns to your application, okay, that same activity is restarted and becomes visible again. It is restarted and becomes visible again. So this part of the life cycle is called the app's visible life cycle. So when your app is actually in the background, it generally, it shouldn't be actually running, shouldn't be actively running, okay? So to preserve system resource and, battery life, okay? So we use this activity life cycle and its callbacks to know when your application is moving to the background so that you can maybe pause some certain operations. So you can actually write such code, such instructions. Okay, when it's actually in the background, I want you to do this. A typical use of a lot of these callbacks is in your music player. Okay, when you're building a music player application, you're going to have to use some of all these callbacks, the on pause and the likes. Okay, so let's do this. So when I press the home button here, you can see on pause is called and then on stop is called. Now, when on pause is called, it means that the application no longer has what? Focus. Focus means you cannot interact with it. Right now, there's no how you can interact with there's nothing you click here that will give any interaction to our application, right? So the on pause is called when the app has no longer has focus. Then after that, on stop, meaning that the app is no longer visible. Remember, on stop is the opposite of on start, okay? So it means that the app no longer has visibility, that is no longer visible on the screen. So although the activity has been stopped, the object is still in memory. That activity object is still in memory, but it's in the background. It has not been destroyed because it's possible the user can actually return to the application. So Android will just keep your activity resources around, just in case. Okay, so let's return to the application using these are recent things. So I'm going to come back here. And then you can see we have on restart, on start, and then on resume. Okay, so when the activity returns to the foreground, Oncreate is not called again. Remember, it's just once. The activity object was not destroyed, of course, so it doesn't need to be created again. That's why Oncreate is not going to be called. So instead, the on restart method is what called. Okay, and then as it is called, the next that is called is on start. On start, of course, because it is visible, and then on resume means it has what focus. It has what focus. Okay. Okay, so that's actually that's the basic life cycles. Okay, some of the things we'll still get to talk about them and use them. Okay, use them as we're actually building certain applications. We'll get to actually use them. Okay, so any question? All right, this is actually a very short class. Any question? So let me just summarize, okay? Okay, go ahead.
So I have a question, but not doesn't have anything to do with the life cycle we treated today.
Okay.
Yes, I wanted to ask the major difference between list view and recycler view.
The major difference between list view and recycler view.
Yes.
Okay, both of them are actually lists. Okay, both of them, they're actually lists. Use them to represent lists, but I won't really, what I would actually say, I would actually say this: you should actually use your recycler view, okay, in situations where you want to show a lot of items and those items are dynamic. You should only use list view when the number of items is always the same and is limited to the screen size. Okay, if it's always the same and is limited to the screen size. But recycler view is something you use for when you have to show a lot of items. Okay, a lot of items, and then they are actually what dynamic. Okay, so that's actually what I'll, just say. It's just like a better way of what representing a list of items. That's for Recyclerview. It's more like a better way, a more dynamic and efficient way to actually do that. Of course, list view actually works. Okay, it actually works, but the moment Recyclerview came into the picture, a lot of problems was actually solved. Because of course, when you're using just a list, okay, the design of list actually, it's kind of it was becoming a bit challenging. Of course, when user there's what we call user needs. You're building an application for user, and there's a lot of things that users want to actually do, a lot of actions that needs to be taken when you're probably going through a list. So that's what Recyclerview came to solve most of those problems. So it's more efficient, animations is simpler, it's actually very easy to use. Okay, so it's just a better way of representing lists. Now, another thing is, it's just like now when we talk about view groups, we have linear layouts, we have what they call relative layout. Okay, so let me just use linear and relative. Of course, linear it arranges views, either horizontally or vertically. Relative layout arranges its child views in relation to each other. But constraint view, okay, it came to actually be a more it came to just kind of like bring two of them together and better represent views. Okay, so it's not really much of a difference kind of thing. It's just more of, okay, with respect to the data I want to actually serve, okay, which is actually the best to use. They are very simple applications where you can actually just use a list view to put up your items. But when you know that your data is going to be much and you need it to be a bit dynamic, then of course Recyclerview is the best to work with. Okay, I hope that's fine.
Thank you very much, sir.
You're welcome. Okay, so I think that this is where we'll draw the curtain for today. Yeah, so this is actually that. Next week, we're going into much more, interesting stuff next week. So from next week, we should be talking about going into the navigation components. Okay, we're talking about the navigation components in the next next week. We'll talk about the navigation components. Okay, so in absence of that, I think I'm just going to say thank you very much. So let's see.